Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week we sit down with Shari Aronson, the co-owner and co-creative director of Z Puppets Rosenschnoz, a nonprofit arts group on a mission to delight children and adults with feats of imagination. Shari talks about how she and her husband started the organization, previews their next event, which starts on June 1st, and what's behind the name in this week's Who the Folk podcast. Shari Aronson, welcome to Who the Folk podcast. Thanks for joining us this week.
Thank you, Lonnie.
So you are the co-creative director and co-founder of Z Puppets Rosenschnoz.
Yes, I am.
First of all, what is Z Puppets, and tell me a little bit about how the organization came together.
My husband and I started working together in 1998, way last century. My husband is Chris Griffith. And our company has a mission to bring people into the power of playfulness through performances, workshops, and feats of imagination. And so puppetry is one of our main strategies or tools, but we combine that with live music, and then we, are drawing from theater, and we do a lot of arts education. We create interactive environments. So our name came up because we wanted a name that would cause people to laugh right from hearing the name. And a lot of people had said, that we had kind of a European style of physical comedy that we were doing, of that type of theatrical clowning. And so the name came out of Z Puppets Rosenschnoz. And we enjoyed imagining people introducing us that way. And then people call us Z Puppets for short. It's also faux Yiddish for red nose, Rosenschnoz. And my husband had joked, because my mother's maiden name is Rose, and he said, we were talking about how that's probably shortened from something else. Yeah. And so he was saying, it could be Rosenschnoz. And then he says, he's the schnoz and I'm the rose. And then I just found out in the last couple of years, my mother's name, Rose, her family name, was shortened from Rosenkrantz. And I had not known that before.
Close.
Yeah. And about 10 years ago, I actually received an email of a woman in the suburbs who said our name really offended her, and enough so that she contacted us to say that and ask, why would you possibly use that name with the derogatory term schnoz? And so I explained to her through this email of where it came from, and hope that and just asked her to say a little more about why that offended her.
Yeah.
And it was really clear that it was from a different generation. I could imagine growing up in Minnesota and feeling like the schnoz, which to me is a comical word, very, I think of Jimmy Durante, of that kind of vintage humor.
Yeah.
I realized I just, I couldn't take away her experience of why that offended her. And that was a real learning experience for me, just in that exchange.
So did she come around at all as you sort of explained where you were coming from, or was she she was kind of dialed into where she was?
Yeah, she did not, as far as I know, come around because her experience was so strong on a personal level. And, my mom my mom had a lot of formative years in Georgia in the 1950s, and had the experience of being a teacher asking my mom and her one Jewish friend in town. It was a small town in Georgia, and to leave the room. And my mother had always been a real shy, quiet person, and she refused. She said, anything that you say, I can be here for. And the teacher went on to talk to the kids about how the Jews killed Christ.
Oh, well.
Yeah. And so when this woman brought that up, I thought,
you could sort of it sounds like you sort of picture a place where she's coming from.
Yeah, and I felt like I can respect that. I'm not going to try to talk her out of it, and just took that in, and that we're not going to change our name, but I hear her,
Sort of a agree to disagree kind of situation.
Yeah, and a generational reclaiming of something that was formerly derogatory.
It's funny because I never would have thought of that as necessarily derogatory.
I never would either, but at a certain time it is a derogatory term, and I looked it up, and it does, even in the definitions that are available, say, like this big hooked nose, and so, yeah.
You could sort of see where maybe somebody could find a problem with it then, given that definition.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in terms of the sort of creating Z Puppets, first of all, when did you started in '98? You said?
Yeah, we started with a different company name. Our original name was Circus Minimus Puppetry, but there was another couple on the East Coast that was Circus Minimus, and they had the name first. We were also starting to tour on the East Coast, and we were getting confused with them, so we needed a name that no one else had.
I don't think anybody else is grabbing this name.
Yeah.
So you mentioned to me that you were a journalism major in college. What led you to performing arts? How did you get there?
Well, what led me to be a journalism major was that I wanted to be like Darren Stevens on Bewitched, who is in advertising.
Yeah.
And I was like, he gets to come up with wacky, nutty ideas all day long. That's what I want to do. And so I pursued journalism at Indiana University, and I got an internship with an ad agency after my sophomore year, and it was very clear to me that was not a fit. that they were like, where's the wacky? Where's the nutty? They're just all motivated by money. And I was really crushed and thought, I don't know what to do. And I took a playwriting class. And I finished my journalism major, but I started doing theater in this town that it's one of the few places that has a theater that is wholly devoted to new plays.
Oh.
The Bloomington Playwrights Project.
Okay.
And so I started doing theater there. I started producing theater. Those were where my first play started. And I went from Indiana to Minneapolis, and on one of the first days I was here in Minneapolis, a new acquaintance led me to a florist dumpster to dumpster dive flowers, and in that dumpster was Sandy Spieler, the artistic director of In the Heart of the Beast, Puppet and Mass Theater, and she was scrounging flowers for a production there, and I struck up a conversation with her, and I went over to see the production they had up, and I was just really astounded at what you could do with puppetry, and I started volunteering there, and I was really looking for a way to use theater to bring people more into their lives, to really an active use of theater. And that led me to go to the University of Arizona for a graduate degree in drama education. And I accidentally started focusing on the Mexican-American tradition of the tent show, the traveling tent show.
Okay.
And it had a particular clown character that was called El Pelado, the Naked. And he was a type, always male, a type of character that seemed really simple, made a lot of confusions between English and Spanish, and always came out ahead with the authority figures he was going up against. And so that's where my interest in clowning came. And so after I finished my degree, and I met Chris Griffith, who had been a street performer and juggler who was working in the Heart of the Beast. And we met, and that's where our work began, of combining all these elements together.
Well, that's phenomenal, because there's so much that you each draw from to sort of create this. How do you sort of help it keep focus, or is that sort of or is that the idea that it isn't necessarily focused on one thing, that it's sort of broad, and that's what you guys are going for?
That's a really great question, and it is a challenge, but one of the things about us is that we keep ourselves low to the ground. We're not a big organization, so that means we can pivot, for better or worse, to whatever inspires us. And over 20 years of creating work together, we've created over 25 productions, and they're each really different from each other. We have our first show is a glow-in-the-dark ping-pong ball circus.
Wait, what?
That's actually how our work together began. Is my husband Chris was playing with ping pong. Well, he was actually playing with blacklight, and he was just doing experiments with what glowed under the black light, and he looked around his studio and these ping pong balls were glowing, and then pretty soon we created these circus characters out of ping pong balls, and we have been doing that show for 20 years.
Wow.
And to the point where last spring we were in elementary school in North Minneapolis, and I was about to do the show, and I was realizing, one of these students can go home and say, "Mommy, Daddy, I saw a glow-in-the-dark ping pong ball circus," and the parent could say, "I saw that when I was your age." That was a little frightening, it's teetering on the edge of abstract, but kids as young as 2 really respond to that. And then we have our puppet rock yoga adventure for families on the quest for calm, Monkey Mind Pirates, and that's something we've been touring for 10 years now. And then we have also a blacklight show, but a very different style than the circus. Is a glow-in-the-dark performance of mitosis, of cell division, that has a cappella score, and that we're performing at the National Puppetry Festival that's going to be here in Minneapolis in July.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so really, really wide range of styles. We're driven by the idea. It might be an idea for a character. It might be the story. It's not usually driven by the I want to do this style of puppetry. Right. We choose the style of puppetry to best express the idea.
Wow. That's amazing, the creativity and sort of out-of-the-box thinking that you and Chris do to put these shows together.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it just kind of steamrolls. I mean, people will always say, well, where'd you get the idea for that? And occasionally we can point to something, but most of the time it's like we don't know who said what, who came up with what first. Kind of like the Coen brothers.
Do you guys just sort of have like notebooks around, so if somebody says something that you just jot it down because it might?
You would hope, but it's not.
It's not that well thought out.
Well, it's not that it's not well thought out, but it's just that once we get an idea. It's such a long process to create. Puppetry is so time and labor intensive.
Sure.
And a lot of our funding comes from grants, and we're it actually, grants are such an arduous process, but what we found is the best use of grants is to really help envision the idea, to help that be part of the creative process. So that is where a lot of our initial thinking comes out of, is the process of writing these grants, which, I thank Darren Stevens for leading me to my journalism degree, because it's come in handy.
Learned how to write professionally just to do grants, huh?
Yeah. And so our upcoming work, Through the Narrows, we've been working on for over a year in terms of ideation and writing the grant. And we expect this to be phase one. The Through the Narrows is going to be limited to 15 people per event. Oh. We have 5 events, June 1st through the 15th, on Saturdays and Sundays. And so each of these 5 events only 15 people can attend, because it's in our studio.
Oh, okay.
And so this will be our initial process, and ideally we'll expand from there to have us. We probably won't go larger than a 40-person in the expanded version. Okay. But yeah, because it's intended to be a close-up experience. Yeah. Okay,
so it's billed as a watch it, make it, take it event. What does that mean to the people who are going to be there?
Yeah, well, we needed to come up with a title or subtitle that helps say this is not an ordinary show. Okay. It's not, you're not coming to a regular theater and you're not just going to see a show. So there is a performance element. So people will come into our studio space on the corner of 41st and Chicago in Minneapolis, and we will seat them at what we're calling our tablescape. So it's not a set in the normal sense. It's a large table that seats 15 that is sculpted into a landscape.
Okay.
And that's also the stage where the puppets characters will perform. Okay. And we have just enough room for our musician, world music expert, Greg Harrigus. And when I say just enough room, we had to build a platform to raise him up so we could fit him in along with the tablescape and the 15 people. And so it begins with the stories that we're drawing from our own ancestry. So my character is a 3,500-year-old woman who was at the crossing of the Red Sea and perhaps played an uncredited role in the crossing. And Chris's character, Chris is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. Oh, okay. And his story is of a 6-year-old boy who hops through time and was A Witness to the Trail of Tears. Those two characters intersect in this park that is the landscape, and all with Greg's music throughout. And then when their stories intertwine and come to an end, we invite the people present and lead them through creating a figure of someone that they want to call upon for help when they face life's narrow passages. Because a big theme in the stories of this 35-year-old woman and the 6-year-old boy is the concept in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, of facing life's narrow passages, those points in life that we all face at one point or another, that tight squeeze, that rock in a hard place. How do you take your next step forward? So we will lead people to make their own figure, very simple figure, and then they will take that out into the world with them as they work through how they will face their own life struggles.
Well, I think it's interesting, I have the flyer in front of me, and I believe we have the event is on TC Jewfolk, and we'll link to it in the show. But it talks about the step toward liberation. I think it's interesting how your character that you've created for this performance is at the edge of the Red Sea, because I think when you think of all the holidays, and maybe it's not even because it just passed, but you talk about steps toward liberation and injustice and struggle and the rock in a hard place spot that we all kind of find ourselves in at times. I think of Passover, so I think that's an obvious place to draw from.
Yeah, and the part of the inspiration for creating Through the Narrows is just recognizing how many life's narrow passages we're all facing, and wanting to do something to help, and feeling like a lot of it is what is the next step you can take. It's so daunting to think of overcoming obstacles in the world, in your own life. So what is the next step? And the idea that we need to call upon each other. We're not going to take that step alone, or it's just it just is I don't know, good idea to call upon others when you can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, well, last couple questions. We'll let you get back to preparing for Through the Narrows. Favorite Jewish holiday?
Favorite Jewish holiday? Well, Purim's a big playful holiday, and I have really fond memories of making hamantaschen with my mom, and in more recent years, gluten-free hamantaschen. But it also is one of my first theatrical experiences of dressing up as to tell the story just in our home with my sisters. And as I recall, the later, as we got older, the stories got a little wilder.
As things happen, things tend to do when you get older.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a big fan of Purim.
You have a favorite hamantaschen flavor?
Oh, we only do the one, which is the prunes, the poppy seed, the walnuts. Okay. Yeah,
so all together, mixed into a.
Oh yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. What's your hamantaschen of choice?
Oh boy, that's a tough call. I like poppy. We don't make poppy because I'm the only one in the house who eats them. But ones we really like are lemon curd.
Oh my goodness! I have never.
Or cookie butter from Trader Joe's.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, it's good.
Wow. I had no idea the wide world of hamantaschen.
It gets pretty exotic.
Wow.
They're good. Worth a try.
Yeah, I've missed a couple of years of making hamantaschen, and I vow to return.
Excellent. Yeah. And favorite Jewish food?
That's hard. And my mom once wrote. She as an older adult took a class in folk culture.
Okay.
And she wrote her paper on Jewish foods.
Oh.
So big fan of matzo balls, and again, I've developed some gluten-free matzo balls.
Okay.
In the past few years, and big fan of the potato latkes, but when someone else is making them,
I don't blame you. Kitchen smells like it for better or worse for many days.
Yeah, very labor-intensive.
Yes.
But there's a lot. I even like gefilte fish.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is 2 podcasts in a row somebody said gefilte fish. Rarely happens, but 2 in a row.
It'd be cool if some organic, natural food version of gefilte fish was available. I
think those things run counter to each other. I'm not sure that's a thing that could happen.
They stop at the goo.
Yeah,
the goo. Gefilte goo. That would be a great band name.
Gefilte goo. It's yours. Take it. Well, Shari Aronson, thank you so much for joining us. Through the Narrows, 5 performances start on June 1st. We'll have all the details on the website. Thank you very much for joining us this week on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks to Shari for joining us, and thanks to the Geek Love Cafe at Moon Palace Books in Southeast Minneapolis for letting us set up shop and record there. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcast, Google Play, Spotify, and more. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next week.